Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
All right, welcome back to AI, Government in the Future. I am your host, Max Romanik, and today I am thrilled to welcome a leading figure in technology policy, Adam Thierer, to the show. Adam has been shaping the intersection of technology and public policy for over 3 decades. Currently a senior fellow at the R Street Institute, he's a strong advocate for policies that promote innovation and entrepreneurship. Adam's career includes influential roles at the Mercatus Center, the Cato Institute, and the Heritage Foundation. He's also a prolific author, and one of his key works, The Policy Origins of the Digital Revolution and Continuing Case for the Freedom to Innovate, explores how the foundations of digital policy have fostered technological advancement and why protecting the freedom to innovate remains crucial today. In today's discussion, we'll explore these themes further, delving into how emerging technologies like AI are reshaping our economy and governance and the policy frameworks needed to support this transformation. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. As a means of getting us started, you have been at the forefront of technology and policy for over 3 decades, as we just said, and navigating the evolving landscape of AI and its implications for governance. Could you start by sharing a bit of your journey from the early days and how your current role at the R Street Institute has been informed by that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I'm going on 33 years in the field of digital technology policy now. And when I got started in the field, there was no internet. There was, but it was a rudimentary form of what we enjoy today. In fact, true story, when I was working at a think tank in 1993, just a year into the job, I was trying to be a trade policy analyst. And my boss asked me one day as a young 23-year-old, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, well, I'm studying trade and I want to be a trade lawyer, a trade economist. And he's like, well, we have too many people doing trade policy these days in the world. What else interests you? And I said this, have you ever heard of this thing called the internet? And he said, no, never heard of it. Again, this is 1993. You'll have to forgive him. And I said, well, I explained it to him what it was all about. And I said, I think this might be interesting. And maybe there would be some public policy issues here that transcend traditional communications and media policy issues. He's like, okay, fine. Go study that for a little while if you want. It sounds like a fad to me. I actually petitioned him for access for a modem to get a connection to the internet. And I was denied. I was denied on the grounds that it was going to be a fad and wasn't worth the money. And then they rethought it after I petitioned again, and I was off and running, and I just was lucky to be literally right guy at the right place at the right time, sort of stumbled into the new burgeoning digital revolution. And here I am today, still studying the policy implications of it.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting stuff. Aside from the serendipity of being right place, right time, have there been any other sort of pivotal moments or experiences that you think have shaped your perspective on AI currently?
Well, luckily at those days, we weren't doing a lot of internet policy. We were doing telecommunications and media policy. And so in the mid-1990s, I was very actively involved in the formation of what became the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And it was a really interesting lesson, a really interesting moment for us from a governance perspective, because it was a very backward-looking bill. It was a bill that said, oh my gosh, we've got all these problems with telephony and cable and satellite and broadcasting. What are we going to do? And so the bill tried to wrangle through these issues in hundreds and hundreds of pages. And then somewhere deep, deep in this bill as an afterthought was this thing called the internet, kind of a forgotten thing. And thankfully it was forgotten because they didn't mess it up. And so it taught me the lesson. The lesson there was the value of patience and humility in thinking through policy for uncharted waters and understanding that there's only so much you can do to plan a technological revolution. And in fact, all the hand-wringing we did about what to do about those old sectors, all the law that we created, all the new regs, it didn't really mean a lot. But the fact that we gave the internet and e-commerce a wide berth and allowed entrepreneurs in the digital space to go out and, let their creative juices flow and do amazing things, it worked. And it should tell us something about public policy and the need to be very, very careful about how we craft it for new emerging technologies. Yeah,
so that's an awesome lead into my next question. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the forward-thinking policy decisions that were made in the early 90s. And as we're now approaching a potential for what looks like it could be an AI-driven revolution, do you have some key lessons from policy frameworks? Like the 1997 framework for global electronic commerce comes to mind. Do you have any sort of key lessons from those sort of policies that might help us with governance today?
Absolutely. So what you're referring to, the 1997 Framework for Global Electronic Commerce, was a document put out by the Clinton and Gore White House. And that document was very much widely accepted and a lot of bipartisan support. It basically said, like, the internet is something new and different and important, and we should give it a chance. We should understand that, there's a case to be made here for more of a bottom-up, agile approach to its governance. We should let it be a market-driven arena. We should try to solve problems in a different, more flexible way, as opposed to like old licensing regimes and top-down bureaucracies. And so this was an example of what I've gone on in my own work to refer to as a technology or an industry that it was allowed to be born free, as opposed to born into regulatory captivity. This is a fundamental problem for a lot of new technologies that come along. And as we get to AI, this is a problem for many AI issues or sectors, is that immediately when you're confronted with a new thing as a regulator or policymaker, you start thinking about how to fit the square peg into the round hole. And, you just can't. It ends up being that sometimes you need to rethink the old policy paradigms and understand that a little bit of flexibility and, again, humility is necessary. The Clinton-Gore framework brilliantly understood this and said, like, let's give it a chance. Let's allow some time to develop. And let's not follow the European model, they said, which is really interesting. In 1997, the Clinton administration understood the Europeans were already going a very different direction across the Atlantic, which much more of a top-down, heavy-handed approach to sort of guiding everything in a sort of precautionary way. Like, let's have everybody come to us and ask for permission and bend the knee first before they can go out and do anything in this world. And so here we are all these years later, almost 25 years later now, and the results are in. Europe just put out a report this week, in fact, just a few days ago, about the failing state of European competitiveness, especially on digital technology. I always challenge with my students and audiences I speak to. I say, name me a leading digital technology company headquartered in the European Union today. And there's usually a lot of silence. Now, there are a few, but not many. In fact, according to the data, 18 of the 25 largest digital technology companies in the world today are U.S. headquartered companies. And 50%, fully 50% of the largest employers in the digital technology space are U.S. headquartered companies. That has to tell us something about public policy. And what it tells us is that more flexible, bottom-up, market-oriented approach with flexible rules and policy is very positive and conducive for so-called innovation culture in terms of allowing a culture of innovation to flourish. Whereas the Europeans had a very fear-based, threatening approach to these things that at every juncture was guarded by bureaucrats and not allowing people to shake things up or think outside the box. This is, once again, 25 years later, the exact same debate we're having about artificial intelligence and what to do about it.
Sure. And it seems to me that Europe is sort of following the same trajectory they did 25 years ago with their AI law. I'd love to get your perspective on how some of that lighter touch could be applied to some of the common AI policy issues that we see coming up, like ethics and privacy and bias. How do those issues work in a lighter touch regulatory framework like what you're describing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a big question because the first and most important thing to understand when we talk about AI policy, quote unquote, is that it's not just one thing. It's many, many things. Thomas Edison was once asked by someone, like, tell us about the field of electricity and what we should know about it. And Edison said, well, it's not just one field. It's a field of fields, he said. And so whatever one thinks about Edison's assessment of electricity being many different fields or subfields, that is absolutely true of artificial intelligence. There's not just one thing here. There's many, many things here. And at the highest level, we can divide AI and AI policy into two big, large buckets, but then we have to subdivide those buckets. The biggest bucket, the macro, broad-based bucket, is sort of general purpose AI, like regulating AI qua AI as a general purpose technology, something unique and special in and of itself. But then there's a different bucket that we'll just call targeted or sectoral or narrow-based regulation, which is focused in on very specific algorithmic or computational applications. So this might be what we refer to as sort of AI and fill in the blank, AI and medicine, AI and fintech, AI and energy, AI and education, whatever, on that list, law enforcement issues, military. Those are all unique policy issues. And so one of the biggest mistakes we could make, in my opinion, is to try to regulate all things algorithmic or computational the same way and at the same time. And in fact, a lot of AI is already very aggressively regulated by our government. I'm often asking people like, are you even aware of what the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is doing on AI and ML enabled medical devices? Are you aware of how NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, is already addressing driverless cars and going after Elon Musk? Are you aware of what the FAA has done to effectively drive drones, into the ground, excuse the pun, and as opposed to letting them get off of it? Those are autonomous systems, right? These are all forms of AI regulation. There are 439 federal agencies at the federal level that are already aggressively looking at AI policy, and many of which are already regulating it. And so when we think about AI policy, you really, if you want to get anywhere and have a good discussion or get good policy done, you have to break it into smaller components and think about where it makes sense to intervene, where we might already have regulatory capacity to address it, and then where we might need some new laws or policies.
So just trying to then bring that back into, the macro discussion here, it's probably, would it be fair to say that tackling something like AI ethics, way too broad of an aperture? You're capturing too much stuff. There's too many unrelated areas that are falling into it. It would be more an accurate question, at least from a policy perspective, that would help foster innovation, to say AI ethics applied to something, and then that's where you start your discussion, rather than a level or two up in the hierarchy.
Couldn't agree more. Obviously, we have to begin by even defining what those ethics are, or what we mean by them, right? Same with the term safety. I mean, everybody's for safety and ethics. I am, you are, everybody is. But what do you mean by it, right? And people have different conceptions of ethics in some contexts. And, you look at medical devices, it's a good example. What some people think should be allowable, other people would want to see, prohibited fully. And, I could go on through every possible AI application imaginable, and we could have these discussions. But at least in the targeted micro context of fintech or medical devices or whatever, we can at least have a little bit of the past being prologue here. And we can say, here are some metrics we have used to define safety in the context of transportation, finance, healthcare, whatever. They might be rough proxies, but at least they're somewhat more sensible than this broad-based amorphous conception of AI ethics or safety as existential risk, And this is what really concerns me, is that the policy debate over the previous year was driven almost entirely by that sort of what's so-called doomer thinking about AI being an existential threat to humanity. And this is because, in my opinion, the narrative of artificial intelligence and robotics in this country and in the world, I think, has been driven by science fiction, by motion pictures and TV plots. And unfortunately, everywhere you turn there for a while, it was just, the debate was just dripping in dystopian dread about what the machines or the robots or the AI systems were going to do. I think we've turned a little bit of a corner on that. I'm a little bit more optimistic today than I was this time last year, when I was like, oh my gosh, this is a really horrible narrative about AI policy. And there were people talking about big new federal AI commissions and broad-based new liability schemes and AI licensing of AI qua AI, again, like essentially regulating math and computation. This is why I was labeling it at the time a war on computation had broken out. And that was really, really dangerous. And I'm sad to say there are still some bills, we'll probably get to the California bill in a minute, where they still try to adopt a broad-based, like macro approach to like algorithmic risk or AI ethics. I just don't think that's the right way to go about it. And it could have really deleterious ramifications, unintended consequences for innovation, competitiveness, and geopolitical security if we bottle up the world of algorithmic innovation and innovators while China and the rest of the world is, running wild with a very different approach. We can't go down that path. We got to be very, very clear. Targeted sectoral risk-based regulation makes sense. That broad-based, ethical stuff sounds good, but You got to be more concrete if you want to make progress and make sure you don't stop progress of important types.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to dig in a little bit more on some of the ramifications of overregulation. We talked a little bit about them in passing in terms of, stifling innovation and losing competitive edge and stuff. But can we do a little bit of a deeper dive on if one of these big omnibus sort of regulatory regimens was suddenly gaining a bunch of speed? Like what sort of specific harms would we be potentially staring down the barrel of?
Yeah, well, let's step back and do a survey right now where we stand with AI regulation in the United States. As of this morning, there are almost 800 bills pending in the United States that would regulate AI in some fashion. The bulk of those are state and local bills. I think the total is around just under, I think it's around 680 or something. I can't remember. It's a huge number. And then the rest are federal bills, 100 and some federal bills. So regardless, we don't even need to talk about what's in any of those bills. Let's just talk about 800 AI bills. And let's say the two of us get together and create a new small startup to try to go out and build a better proverbial mousetrap to change the world with a new AI application. And the two of us scrap together a little bit of money of our own, of our families, of our friends, and maybe some VCs, and we go at it. Well, we're immediately confronted with hundreds of potential different laws and policies. And regardless of what any of them say, we don't have a compliance department to deal with that. We don't have a budget to hire a bunch of accountants or consultants to cope. The only people that can comply with that sort of a burden, regulatory burden, are the biggest players. And if you look overseas at Europe, there's Exhibit A of what happens when you overregulate in this fashion, and compliance becomes the name of the game. All the European Union has to export now on the digital technology front is regulation. They don't export any products anymore in digital technology. And ironically, all this regulation they're exporting for companies to comply with, the only people that can do it are the very large company that they decry and say, we want to do something about these large companies. Well, what you're doing is you're making them more powerful because they're the only ones with the departments that can handle this. What's even more insulting about this, by the way, just as an offshoot, is the fact that the European Union has even had the audacity to come to Silicon Valley and set up a new EU compliance office to tell Silicon Valley innovators how to comply with their rules over in Brussels, which is to me outrageous, just outrageous that that's happening. But that's where the European Union's at, and that's where we do not want to be as a nation, because they have hollowed out their technology core on the digital technology space, much as they have in many ways on energy. But the bottom line is that from a regulatory perspective, just the sheer volume of rules can be overwhelming, and we've got to be careful. This is why I'm a big believer we probably need some sort of preemption on AI like we had for the internet. We didn't have 50 different federal internet commissions. We didn't have a bunch of licenses in every jurisdiction before you started a new smartphone app or a social networking platform. You just went out and did it. It was permissionless innovation. And, to the extent you had that regulation, it was on the back end. It was ex post as opposed to ex ante regulation, which is a crucial thing to think about. It's not that we don't want rules, but we want to give innovation a chance, let innovators be innocent until proven guilty. And then if they do something wrong or create real harm, we throw the book at them. We go after them. And we've got a lot of law to do it. And I'm always amazed in this AI debate today how people just ignore all the law that we have on the books. And the fact that we also have the most overly litigious, tort system in the world. So even if you don't get hit by the regulatory book, you get hit in the courts by trial lawyer liability. That being said, there are rules that are moving along, some of which could be far more burdensome than others. And I'm not against all the rules or bills that are pending in the states, but the problematic ones, like what California has done and other states, would basically try to regulate AI at a very high level, at the so-called model level, to regulate, again, computational capacity and large-scale computing on the theory that powerful computing and math itself is per se harmful. And that, to me, is insane. I think that's the wrong place to start a debate. The right place to start a debate, and the best bills in the states, are those that take, again, the targeted focus, look at very specific concrete concerns and say, could it be maybe that the use of AI in this policing context could create unique dangers that we might want to address preemptively? Okay, that's a more reasonable conversation to have. Let's maybe talk about how police could use AI in profiling, and while we want to put some safeguards on that, or let's talk about maybe AI in the classroom or AI in elections. These are better conversations to have about AI governance or regulation than the idea of like, let's regulate all AI. Let's regulate all models. If it's big and powerful, it's got to be bad. No, that's to me, that's very immature and it's very dangerous thinking.
So it's hard to ask this next question without there being an air of conspiracy behind it, and I do not intend it as such. But to your point about the current regulatory regimens that are a bit overreaching, sort of consolidating power with those large providers, there's also fairly significant overlap with those providers being data brokers themselves. They own a lot of the data that those models are trained on and that they use. Is conflating the two issues of data broker and then the math and algorithmic science that applies the data towards a problem, is that tension at all present here? And is there any sort of possibility that attempt at the overregulation is specifically to force the power into those consolidated groups?
Yeah, that's a keen insight, I think, because obviously the debate about data and data handling and data privacy and security is now fundamentally tied up with the debate about AI policy, when in reality, they're different debates. And it's not to say that we have been struggling for many years to try to get a baseline comprehensive national data privacy bill passed in Congress, and my organization favors that. There are some state measures on privacy, of course, and that number is growing. There's a lot of different things going on cybersecurity. And all of these have a relationship with AI broadly, because AI at root is all about data science mixed with computational power. But on the data science thing, data science depends upon data. And a lot of that data can be sensitive or, requiring some safeguards. And that's an understandable debate to have. Now, I'm a big believer in the importance of making sure we don't completely shut down that spigot and, kill what is really the fuel that powers these algorithmic systems. If you want to move the needle in terms of like human health and welfare using, artificial intelligence systems, you've got to have data inputs, and they've got to be constantly improving data sets, or else you just won't get the data science that is needed to compute, to power the AI systems. But getting back to the policy side of this, this goes back to my first principle about breaking the debate into smaller components and figuring out like maybe it would be better to start with something about cybersecurity, something about privacy, and then get to the question of more broad-based AI regulation. I think the problem is, as we saw last year with the big privacy bill in front of Congress, is that it got very large and very bloated, trying to appease a lot of different concerns and interests. And then it also included AI regulation on the back end of it. And that was very, very problematic to me. There was a whole section about algorithmic justice or fairness and about having AI impact assessments, being mandated by law. I just think that's a mistake. I think we should peel those things out of that bill, focus on data handling, data privacy, like how long can data be retained? What types of sensitive data shouldn't be collected at all? How do you minimize those things that are problematic? That's a better debate to have. But when you get into the broader thing where we conflate it all under one thing and you create essentially a legislative Christmas tree with like a president under it for everybody, guess what? You'll make no progress. And that bill died again this session. I just don't think you can pass it unless you do break it down into smaller chunks, but we'll see.
Another heavily related concept that comes up in this space is the pacing problem with having fast-moving tech and slow-moving governance and regulation that might follow it. What sort of strategies are out there that you think might be effective in a regulatory environment that is effective and adaptive and has at least some chance of keeping pace, or at least getting the pacing to the point where you're not stifling innovation at the expense of completely eliminating any protections?
Yeah, wonderful question. So the pacing problem refers to the idea that technological change is at least linear and sometimes exponential, but public policy change is incremental at best. And the gap between those two things just continues to grow, the pace of technological change versus the pace of policy change. And that's the so-called pacing problem. The pacing problem has become a chronic problem for all technology sectors, but especially artificial intelligence, where the state of the art is moving so much faster than the ability of policy to keep up. And you wouldn't want policy to try to bottle up everything based upon hypothetical, developments in the future, because we'd probably get it wrong if we try to engage in that sort of techno crystal ball gazing. And so the question is, how do you get so-called agile iterative governance for AI that keeps pace without destroying the underlying goose that lays the golden eggs in the sector. And that's really, really hard. The way that I think it works best is when we have agencies and officials who work in a more decentralized, multi-stakeholder fashion, utilizing what are so-called soft law techniques as opposed to just hard law techniques. I want to make clear that there's a role for hard law, traditional regulation and statutes, but increasingly a lot of emerging technology policy, especially in the United States, is more governed by so-called soft law. Soft law can include anything from sort of informal multi-stakeholder processes, agency guidance documents, workshops, technical standards, and so on and so forth. And so a lot of agencies, including ones that are very heavily handed in regulatory in the past, have started making a little bit of a turn. If you look at how, for example, the FDA is regulating AI, it's not exactly regulating AI-enabled medical devices the same way it's always regulated traditional medical devices. Instead, they're issuing a lot of amorphous guidances and things that change constantly that aren't even clearly enforceable. They're just like, here's some best practices that you should follow, or a code of conduct. And oh, by the way, come talk to us if you're doing anything more risky than this, because then you might need a formal approval. Now, that type of so-called soft law, and I should mention, this is not just medical devices. This soft law framework I'm describing very much governs driverless cars in this country. We do not have a federal driverless cars bill. What we have is guidances for industry developing driverless autonomous vehicle technology. And this is what's happening in a number of other contexts. So this is, again, becoming more the norm than anything. There's a good and a bad to this. The good, I've already stressed, is it's more agile, iterative, flexible, and moves closer to the pace of change. And some organizations like the National Institute of Science and Technology and others can help formulate these standards in a real-time basis. There's a downside. The downside is that this process is a little bit more open-ended, and there's a fear about accountability and the sort of rule of law. You know, if we're sort of making it up as we go along to try to keep pace with technology, are we making it up in such a way that it's not even clear how it's enforced, or what your liability is under that regime, or what rights you have as a consumer for redress? That's tricky. I think we can get around it, but it's messy. It's very messy. And a lot of people say we should go by the book. Well, the problem is the book is broken, and the book basically makes it so that innovation can't happen. And we don't want that. So the book doesn't need to be completely thrown away, but the book needs to change. It needs to at least add a new chapter or two about how to do this better. And I think we're slowly moving in that direction. If for no other reason, we're moving that direction just because Congress is so dysfunctional and broken that they can't pass any new laws. And so we're stuck with the make it up as you go along soft law kind of governance processes, for better or for worse. I still think there's more benefits than drawbacks, but there could be abuse. There could be abuse, including right now we have a brand new so-called AI Safety Institute that's been formed within the NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, to oversee large-scale AI model safety. And basically has said, like, we want the large model makers like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and Microsoft to bring their models to us and sort of pre-vet them to make sure they're safe. Well, no law was passed saying that. There was no regulation implemented. There was nothing that's even FOIA-able that you could petition to say, let me see your rules on this. There were no rules. They just kind of decreed it. And they said, it's voluntary. And we would hope you'd make some concessions, voluntary concessions. It's like, how voluntary is it when these companies are called to a White House Rose Garden ceremony and said, we expect you to do this. And so there is a danger there. And I got to tell you, I'm very torn about this because I'm a big believer in the rule of law and going by the book to some degree as a stickler for due process and constitutionalism. At the same time, as I've already said, if we go too much by the book, then we're just not going to get any innovation at all.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a potential opportunity to get some international cooperation as well with that more soft law approach. I mean, it strikes me as very similar to the conversations I was sitting through in my law school classes back in the day around international law and what is it, soft law, hard law. And, you'd have like the very conservative people in the class who are like, listen, there's treaty law and then nothing. And then there's this other sort of perspective of like, well, there's soft law and there's other ways to foster a degree of cooperation, participation amongst sovereign bodies. This seems like we might have a better opportunity about getting some of those international standards done through a lens like this.
You got it exactly right. In fact, we can learn a lot from environmental law in this context, or environmental policy, because in the environmental context, we've struggled for many, many decades now to try to come up with international accords and agreements. And, sometimes we've made some progress, but most of the time we haven't on formal accords or treaties. But there's a lot of soft law governance mechanisms or soft, power governance mechanisms or standards that have helped. Likewise, with regards to things like arms control, there's a need for international conversations about dangerous weapons of war or other things. And, we have these conversations, but we don't always come up with treaties. And even when we do, people cheat. One of the things I'm always pointing out, like why we've been careful about the idea of like an international AI regulatory body or treaty is like, I always ask, well, is China and Russia going to play ball? Because if they're not, what's the point? We wouldn't want to tie our own hands while our adversaries race ahead, right? And, so there's limits to soft power, but there's limits to hard power as well. I mean, the world made a big deal in 1972 about the Biological Weapons Convention. And the BWC was very noble, very well-intentioned attempt to try to rid the world of biologics as a weapon, as a munition of war. Totally understandable. And a lot of countries signed on to that, including the United States and the Soviet Union, and said, we are not going to use biological or chemical weapons in war. And what did the Soviet Union do? They went right back to Moscow and ordered their scientists to double down on chemical and biological weapon production. We learned this after the wall fell, right? But the United States, we weren't stupid. We knew that they were probably going to cheat. And so we had to sometimes develop our own capacity or at least research how these things were used so we weren't left completely blindsided by a dangerous weapon of war. This is what I call the sort of like second best world of governance we're in for AI. We have to think about what our backup plan is, because these grandiose schemes of like international coordination on like AI governance and regulation, it's not going to happen. I'm not sure it should happen. I don't want necessarily one big international regulator of AI because I'm not sure we're going to agree on values. You going back to your first principles question about ethics, what is the world's ethical baseline for the relationship between artificial intelligence and democracy and free speech?
And can they even coexist?
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you the first thing we know for sure, the rest of the world doesn't have a First Amendment. And so they're not going to go along with us on the idea that should be the sort of principle baseline in terms of where we start the conversation. Like the principle should be maximizing freedom of speech, expression, and information. They're going to say, no, we're in a very different space on that. We're learning that just this past month with what Europe's tried to do to like come after certain American companies or platforms for things that are said on Twitter or, Facebook or something. So we can't even agree on high level ethics at an international level to get the conversation rolling. We're going to have to rely on more soft power and formal agreements, baby steps approaches. Instead of multilateralism, we might need to have minilateralism, where sort of a coalition of the willing work together in a more targeted way to try to advance the ball on AI safety in very specific ways. I won't go off on a tangent on this, but just an example I keep going back to medical devices and AI. There's an entire international body nobody knows about called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. It's a collection of regulators from around the world at the equivalent FDAs from other countries that come together and talk about how to coordinate standards for medical devices, including AI-enabled medical devices. It doesn't mean we have international law for AI medical devices. But what it means is we have some greater degree of coordination and governance of these things to have a little bit more harmonization or equalization. That's a good thing. I think that's good. And in fact, I actually like EU food and drug regulation and medical device regulation a little bit more than I do American regulation. It's one of the very few times I can say that. So I'm kind of hoping we do, equalize in that direction a little bit more. But that's a more pragmatic conversation. And the fundamental thing that it frustrates so many policymakers and pundits in this world is they're looking for this elusive and completely imaginary Goldilocks formula of getting everything just right. Not too hot, not too cold. Got to get that right solution. Just get it right. And my attitude is like, no, there's no Goldilocks formula. And maybe I'm just jaded from years of doing this, or maybe I'm just far more pragmatic and realistic because I just look at the realpolitik of like international AI governance and say, this is not going to work, folks. There's no way. It's not just China and Russia not signing on to stuff. How about the biggest open source model in the world besides Facebook's Llama model for AI is Falcon 180B, which is developed by the UAE. The government of the UAE funded that model. And then they released it to the world. Are we going to go in as a government and tell the UAE, you cannot release your open source model to the world because it's a violation of our laws? Good luck with that. The sultans and the others are going to say, get the hell out of our face. We're not going to go along with what you want here because we want to develop our own algorithmic and computational capacity as a nation. And they have every right to do so. Every right to do so.
That's really interesting. Just the notion of balkanization of, governance and requirements gathering and that sort of thing versus something that looks more like an international standard setting body that has broad international collaboration like the IEEE or
ISO, ACM, BSI. Yeah, lots of groups like that.
It's a fine line between which one is a open source consortium working for the betterment of the technology versus, entrenched special interest, maybe violating civil rights, depending on your definition of civil rights, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I get that. We don't really have a good term for this in the United States, but when I was living in Britain, I found out about this term that the Brits use, Quango. Quango is quasi-autonomous non-governmental organization. And, there's a lot of Quangos in the UK and other countries that sort of float in between private and public. They're right there in between. And we do have Quangos in the United States. And you mentioned, IEEE and I mentioned ACM, but there's others. There's others that have a little bit of both kind of powers. They play an increasingly important role as an intermediary in the world of modern technological governance. I was just at an event before our podcast here today on Capitol Hill with the IEEE, where they were talking about AI safety standards and how they're formulating more and more ongoing agile way and doing it in an international basis and getting international buy-in. And this is another benefit of the sort of soft law or soft power approach because, we can get probably a little bit more agreement about and rough consensus around sort of soft law standards than we could a formal treaty that everybody has to sign off on. Going back a generation for the internet, that one of the most crucial bodies for internet governance was called the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF. And they helped us negotiate international standards for domain names and other things. And their motto was so-called running code and rough consensus. Running code and rough consensus. I love that phrase. And I think it's perfectly applicable to AI. I wrote a whole paper about it saying, this is our model still. We have to constantly be iterating both in technology and in policy to come up with a rough consensus about governance and ethics. We all want to so-called bake in ethics by design in the AI development process to make sure it's aligned with human values. But that's not a one and done process. It's an ongoing iterative process and conversation, right? But that fact frustrates people endlessly because they don't it's just messy. It's messy and imprecise. You have to learn to live with the messiness of AI governance and love it. But a lot of people just can't. They want a lot more certainty in one direction or the other. And part of my argument is like a practical one too, just saying I don't think you're going to get what either of you want on the extremes. You're going to have to meet in between some.
Yeah, exactly. Focusing on the bell curve is great, but the arguments at the 2 standard deviations beyond are certainly more entertaining. Switching gears here a little bit, how do you see policymakers and industry leaders, innovators, hopefully being able to work together to address some of these challenges? I mean, I think the soft law concepts that you and I had been talking about, some of these quasi non-governmental entities are certainly a great start, but do those things do they have enough fuel in the tank to get us where we need to go? Or is there going to have to be a jumping off point here somewhere that policymakers should really have their eyes towards?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think that remains to be determined how this plays out. And I think the wild card here is the fact that states are moving now much, much faster than the federal government. I mentioned of the 800 bills pending that the vast majority of them, almost 700 of them, are state bills. And what I failed to mention is that count does not include municipal AI bills, which are now proliferating rapidly. There's been important bills passed recently by the city of New York and the city of San Francisco. And there are even counties getting involved in AI regulation. So again, there's a patchwork, and then there's a patchwork of patchworks that's a living hell for us, right? I have advocated in my work some sort of degree of preemption of state AI regulatory activity, but I'm here to tell you that's dang hard. It's really hard to know how to preempt. You can preempt maybe at the model level, like saying no regulation of underlying computation or the models. But everything you do beyond that gets a lot harder and encounters a lot more resistance. I wish that wasn't the case because, again, going back to our internet example, we very specifically, explicitly preempted state activity in terms of like licensing certain types of things or taxing things. I mean, there was an entire bill passed in 1998 called the Internet Tax Freedom Act that dealt with so-called discriminatory state and local broadband taxes. And it even had some language about sales taxes in it. So it's like we had a model there for like regulating right down to the core of the fiscal power of a state or local government. And then we had other things that were passed, little smaller things that made it clear that the state shouldn't muck with the marketplace for e-commerce nationally. That's all gone. That consensus is all gone. Everybody's off and running. And it's because there's a lot, AI and tech companies have a lot of enemies. A lot of people, not just on the left, but on the right, want to see regulated for, AI regulated for very different purposes. And, we've already had 2 bills go to the Supreme Court based upon like, the algorithms that power social media speech. And those were driven by Florida and Texas in conservative efforts. They were led by conservative governors, conservative legislatures, pushed bills through that went all the way to the Supreme Court to be tested. So this isn't just a left-right thing. This is like an everybody wants their paws all over AI thing. And so I'm not sure how to answer your question. I'm not sure, what a jumping off point is or means. I do know this. Some people that have passed state laws, even they have acknowledged that there's a potential problem there. Governor Jared Polis, someone who I think very highly of, Colorado governor, former member of Congress, he passed a very important, first of its kind, comprehensive state AI law. But in passing it, he had a signing statement that read more like a veto statement. And in it, he talks about the potential burdens on Colorado innovators in the AI space from the bill and the problems he hopes are corrected before it's implemented. But then amazingly, he ends up pleading with Congress to do something about this. And I'll just read you his exact quote. He calls for, quote, a needed cohesive federal approach, end quote, that is, quote, applied by the federal government to limit and preempt varied compliance burdens on innovators and ensure a level playing field across state lines, along with ensuring access to life-saving and money-saving AI technologies for consumers. Well, that's a great statement. I love that. But he signed the bill. He signed the first ever major state bill and then said to Congress, please do something about me. You don't see a governor do that too often. But he is absolutely right. Governor Polis was correct to identify the problem of this state-by-state patchwork that we've talked about multiple times here. And the problem is, of all the bills that are pending at the federal level, there's 14 or 15 right now. None of them have a thing to say about this. They don't say anything about preempting the states. All they do is basically say we're going to sort of like regulate over and above what the states are going to do. That's so-called floor preemption as opposed to ceiling preemption. Ceiling preemption is putting a cap saying you can't regulate above this kind of level or something. Like the FDA and FAA very clearly have limits on what states can do to regulate, like drugs, medical devices, or flying things in the FAA context. And that's pretty plenary authority, right? That is ceiling preemption. But there's another type of preemption called floor preemption. Like, well, we're going to have some policy at the federal level over and above what states are doing. And my argument is that's not preemption at all. That's just another layer of compliance burden. You're just regulating over and above what the states are doing. Real preemption means you have to put some limits on what states can do altogether and say like, sorry, no, you just can't go here because this is interstate computational commerce and speech. We regulate, I always argue in my work, and the first of my boring 10 books was on federalism, interstate commerce, and technological issues. And I made the point in that book that even though I'm a big believer in federalism, again, there have to be some limits, and that the most important thing that America got right that drove our economic engine of success historically is that we had the biggest free trade zone in the world. And we still do today. When you drive across America state by state, you're not stopped at every border and checked, you don't have to pay a levy at every single border. You actually have a truly free flow of commerce everywhere. And the same should be true for digital bits. We should basically make sure that computational technologies, innovation, and speech are able to move generally pretty freely. But what we're talking about here today with, 800 bills pending and a lot of meddlesome things happening at the city level too, that is a death warrant for innovation. That's the opposite of a free trade zone. And I'm really, really concerned that this is going to turn out badly when we come back next year and start anew and we see even more bills of this sort.
Yeah, and it seems also counterproductive to a lot of their aims. We have a lot of clients who have gotten very excited about AI, have made a number of investments. They're starting to use them. And then, oh my goodness, where's the governance structure? How do we harmonize all of this? How are we supposed to actually do all of this? And I feel like that's what's driving a lot of the legislatures to feel like they're prompted to take action. But they're not completing the loop, which is if you then go ahead and proceed with this, now it's not a matter of, oh, I've bought something and I can't use it. It's that there's going to be nothing for you to buy except for by the carriers you've said you don't want to use, because they're the only ones big enough to comply with that patchwork regulation.
And there's another added wrinkle to this, which is even more problematic from my perspective, which is that there's a really ugly dynamic now where a lot of industries and sectors and trade associations are kind of like throwing each other under the bus, like saying, we're not the problem. You should go look at them, and that, what was Franklin's quote about, like, if we don't hang together, we'll assuredly hang separately, or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but, the point is that, like, you would hope that, like, all of these different AI related companies' interest sectors would kind of hang together and work hard together to, like, get a good frame. It's not the case. It's basically they're covering their own butts in their own context and saying, like, give us, freedom for me, but not for thee. And this is a very bad dynamic. We don't have like a single AI trade association at the federal level driving this. We have a lot of different trades and then all these sub-trade groups and various member companies that are all out there doing their own thing. So I don't see a consensus approach emerging right now. And again, I wouldn't be as worried about that if not for the fact that the states are advancing measures very, very rapidly and without a lot of really good thought put into them in some cases. I mean, I don't want to talk poorly about state lawmakers. They do hard work, and I get it. They're busy people, and some of them aren't paid well or at all. Some of them only work certain months of the year. But the reality is there's a lot of technological ignorance on this front. This is a hard issue. I mean, we've spent a lot of time ourselves getting up to speed, and I don't know about you, but I always feel like I'm completely ignorant about what's going on in this space. It's really hard to stay on the cutting edge. And the lawmakers have a zillion other policy issues to do. And then one day they're hit with a bill that's a 150-page bill on regulating AI. And somebody on their staff says, have you seen Terminator? Oh boy, it's scary, isn't it? And then they sign a bill. They say, I'll co-sponsor. And there was a lawmaker when the California bill was moving, SB 1047, who literally got up on the floor and said like, I don't know anything about AI. I don't even really know anything about this bill, but I know we need to get out ahead of it and make sure it's safe. It's like, what? What did you just say? You say you know nothing about this bill or nothing about the issue, but you say because there is a bill before you, it is something and we must do something. That is the wrong way to make public policy for an industry and technology of geopolitical significance to our nation. The Chinese have promised to race ahead and beat the United States by 2030 on AI. And we can kind of laugh at that off, but the reality is they're making enormous progress. And, all you need to do is go back to our point about what's happened to the Europeans, how they've hollowed out their base and what that's meant for their competitiveness. Look at the trouble they've got themselves in energy. There are real world ramifications to getting technology policy wrong. This isn't just about, new gizmos and gadgets. It's about, of course, it's about life-saving and life-improving innovations and, exciting new things, but it's also about security. It's about geopolitical competitiveness and security, and we can't ever forget that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're about out of time, but I will give you last word on this question. We started touching at the periphery of it, but we do have a lot of listeners who are themselves policymakers or at least influential folks to help steer the course of policy. What specific advice would you have for those folks to keep themselves up to speed and current on these issues and making sure that they're at least thinking through a sane lens when they try to tackle these topics?
Yeah, great question. It's one I get a lot from state and local lawmakers. And I always begin by saying, look, the best place to start any debate about new emerging technologies is with what I call the study and review process. You need to seriously study the issue, put together maybe task force, blue ribbon commission at the state level. We've had several of these at the federal level, but these are good things to do, to study the issue, identify potential policy gaps or risks, but don't try to bite off more than you can chew. Take the incremental approach. Look at a more focused bottom-up kind of thing. And it could be that we do miss some things, but I always ask policymakers, I'm like, look, I get it. You don't like the way everything turned out with the internet and digital technology. And I know you like some tech, there's some tech companies you don't like. But the reality is if I was sitting with you in 1993 and having a conversation about this, everything we would have been talking about, we would have gotten wrong. We would have been like predicting the wrong fears, the wrong problems, or we wouldn't have really known how to do it. And if we did try to like box it all up by design in a precautionary way, we wouldn't have had the internet we know today. When I was growing up doing technology and information policy as a kid, and I was studying this, I was studying telecommunications and media systems. And the number one goal of information and communications technology policy was alleviating the so-called scarcity problem, the fact that we had too few informational inputs as a civilization. We have solved that problem in our generation. We now live in a world where we bitch about information abundance. And people are like, oh, all these choices, all of this information. And I'm like, you know what? I've lived through this, both ends of this. And I'm here to tell you, information abundance is a better problem to have than information scarcity. And yes, there have been problems. And yes, there will be new problems with AI, but it's not going to be some sort of civilizational collapse or any of this sci-fi dystopian nonsense. It's going to be smaller problems that we can't anticipate. A lot of people are running around looking at smaller problems right now, but they often don't guess right. I mean, everybody has been in a real panic about AI and elections, but the more you look at it, you're like, that seems like a little bit of a nothing burger right now. But behind the scenes, there's a different problem, a more traditional one having to do with data security, cybersecurity, that is maybe going under-addressed, and I'm like more worried about that myself than on like the AI and election stuff. So it's about patience and humility. And it's something that is not in large supply with a lot of policymakers, but I always begin by studying and reviewing, focusing on concrete problems as they come at us, roll with the punches, be resilient, but embrace technological change and the wonderful capacity for AI to be the next great technology of freedom.
Incredible last words, Adam. Thank you so much for a great conversation today. And for the rest of our viewers and listeners, we'll see you next time.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.